Alrighty, here we go. Admitting all. Okay, we have the recording going. Hello all, and welcome to our panel today, India and China as emerging global powers in a post-COVID-19 world. My name is Alexandria Maloney, and I'm a board member with BPIA, which is Black Professionals in International Affairs. So I'd like to say thank you to all of our partnering organizations who are participating. And we would like to note that the views presented are wholly those of the individual participants. So to introduce the panelists, I'm joined by, firstly, Mr. John Dickson. John currently serves as the chairman of the World Trade Centers Association's Committee on Peace and Stability through Trade. He's actively working to establish World Trade Centers in Kurdistan, Iraq, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, Oklahoma for Native American Indians, and in Shenyang, China, where he's working with investors to develop a $500 million World Trade Center complex. Next, Arpit Chaturvedi has been a coordinator with the Indian School of Public Policy, lecturer at San Francisco State University, and is currently the CEO of Global Policy Insights. Jonathan Cummings is currently serving as a member of the United Nations Steering for the Alliance of NGOs and CSOs for South-South Cooperation. He has had significant professional experience working on political campaigns, international NGOs, and operating within the United Nations space. Jonathan Cummings is originally from Kingston, Jamaica, and is currently based in New York City. Lastly, Vannery Kong, she is currently the U.S. Sherpa for the Youth G7 Summit, specifically with their Global Connectivity and Trade Working Group. She's most recently represented the U.S. in the G20 Summit and the Youth Engagement Group. She's also a board member of Black Professionals in International Affairs, works regularly on African American and Cambodian issues, and she currently is a graduate student at Harvard University studying her master's in public policy and cybersecurity. So thank you to all the panelists for joining today.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Alex.
Sure. So I am going to jump into these questions, but before I do, I will, one, admit the folks waiting in the waiting room, and two, encourage those who are on the call. Thank you for being here for this conversation. Please feel free to comment any questions that you may have in the chat, and we'll do our best to address those and incorporate them into this conversation. So the first question that I have is in regards to the Indo-Pacific region. So how are countries in this region managing the COVID-19 pandemic, and what threats and opportunities does this create for India and China within the region? So Jonathan, maybe you'd like to start.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. So for the Indo-Pacific region, that term refers to the maritime space starting from the west coast of the United States all the way to the west part of India. So in that region, it encompasses countries such as Australia, Japan, Bangladesh, the ASEAN nations, which is, the Association of Southeastern Asian Nations. So the Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, and so on and so forth. And management varies, it really varies. So in Singapore, the lockdown restrictions have been eased and some businesses have started operating. In Malaysia, there are about 7,000 cases confirmed, and it's surpassed any ASEAN country with the most recoveries. But then you get to cases such as with India, where it now has ballooned to over 70,000 people in India, people who have the virus. And I honestly think that these numbers aren't completely accurate. And the reason being is because this reflects the amount of people who have been identified to have the virus. The people who have actually come to the hospitals who are sick, people who have been tested. So I don't think these numbers are completely accurate. And what this highlights, to be honest, is that the individual government responses in each country. So I think after this pandemic, individual countries are going to have to take a deep look at themselves and see how they work on delivering services to the people, to the population, and how they respond to different times of crisis. So to India and China, actually, with threats and opportunities, I think that really depends on your perspective, right? Because China is using this as an opportunity to advance its foreign policy agenda. That's how I look at it. So just recently, a couple weeks ago, actually, China started reasserting its claims to the South China Sea. So China actually named 2 new districts dividing the South China Sea, which included the Farsil Island group near the Vietnam and the Spratly Island groups near the West Philippines. And they've even went so as far as putting some people in charge of it, stating that this is their claim, this is their territory. And so China is starting to advance their foreign policy agenda while the world is distracted with the COVID-19 virus. They're using the US isolationist stance on removing funding or freezing funds to the World Health Organization to advance their interest in multilateral organizations as well. But beyond China, India is actually starting to attract a lot more foreign direct investment. A couple of weeks ago, Facebook invested $5.7 billion in India, making it the single largest investment in India's tech sector. And a couple of days ago, actually, Apple, a tech group that supplies technology and equipment to Apple, invested 20 billion rupees, which is the equivalent of 278 million USD. So a lot of businesses are looking for alternate places to do work, and India, I believe, is capitalizing on that. They're looking to leave China and move into India. So I see this is a great opportunity for India post-COVID-19.
Thank you, Jonathan. Arpit, would you like to share your thoughts on how, what threats or opportunities does the current COVID-19 pandemic create for India and China within the region?
Sure. Thank you, Alex. Actually, a lot of threats and opportunities because, oftentimes we've seen in the world that global systems generally become stabilized when there is at least one hegemon who is ensuring the security and the world order. Now, we've seen through history that it is during crisis situations that a lot changes during the global world order. And if you look back in the mid 14th, 15th century, we had the bubonic plague, the Black Death, which was spreading across Europe, and that coincidentally is also the time when northwestern Europe was able to gain greater power and greater comparative advantage over the southern states of Italy. And we saw that again over and over again a lot of times. Last time it was during the World Wars when the United States emerged as the global hegemon. And unsurprisingly, China is using this opportunity to emerge as a veritable hegemon. But while doing that, I think, and China, to be honest, it has great opportunity right now. Like Jonathan said, China is reasserting or continuing to assert itself in the South China Sea. At the same time, China is probably the only country in the world which has its supply chains intact, and they are making pretty good use of it. China has opportunities, to continue its policy of building the Silk Route and exercise influence in Africa and Latin America. But at the same time, one thing that I believe that China is not doing enough is appreciating the importance of soft power as a strategic advantage. And that, I believe, is something that becomes an opportunity for countries like India and other countries in the ASEAN region, because, as you would have read, that India has put 2 Navy ships on the beck and call for the world that whoever demands help from India, we're going to give it to any country which is in trouble, including Pakistan and China. India sent a group of doctors to Wuhan. We've been sending hydrochloroquine to the United States, to China, to even Pakistan. So gradually, India is gaining the confidence of the world in exercising its soft power and assuring the world that it is, if it gains more power as a country, then it will create a world order which is peaceful, which is collaborative, and wherein India as a country will emerge as a partner which has good intent and great capabilities. In fact, India, as you'd also see, it has become in the past 2 months the second largest producer of PPE kits in the world. At this stage, we are producing 200,000 kits per day. And I think it is not just the soft power aspect of it, but then real capabilities in which India is showing a lot of adaptability. At the same time, other opportunities for India, as Jonathan rightly said, Apple, Facebook, all of these multinational organizations have started investing in India. And now I think increasingly, the global investments will also start moving out of China. And at any rate, they're at least not going to increase in China at the rate at which they were increasing earlier. And countries like India, countries like Philippines, Vietnam, all of these are to benefit from such a move.
Thank you, Arpit, for sharing that. John Dixon, did you have any thoughts on what threats and opportunities that the COVID-19 pandemic is creating for India and China within the region?
Thank you, Alexandria. First of all, I'd like everybody to recognize that my participation on this panel is for generational diversity. I visited the first time I went to China and also to India was 1982. I was doing a study of architecture in holy lands around the world, and it's how it is the language and voice of these different religious and cultural traditions. And in India, it was very rich and lively and remarkable. I was in Varanasi and Mumbai and Alora and Ajanta and everywhere there was a really vibrant faith and connection of the people, regardless of traditions, and very, very many different ones there. And China, it was all museums. When we visited temples in China, they were, even in 1982, they were museums. And it's because of the system that runs, that the country operates under. And that the pandemic has brought an attention, I think, to that system, that the Communist Party is really problematic. It's been hard to see that because we just see the development of these. I was so excited for the private sector there, that could have an impact and change the leadership. I chaired the China Society in Washington, D.C. for many years, which purpose was to create mutual understanding and respect between China and the U.S. and the West. And it seemed like things were trending very well, that the strategy was good. But actually, the pandemic has really brought out the man behind the curtain, and I think people can see how destructive that is. So India has always been a remarkable country in the world, actually, on the world stage. And it's like the girl that everybody wants to date, and she won't commit to anyone. She'll never be anybody's girlfriend. But she's always there and willing to go to dinner and go out and have drinks. So for India, already, I think last fall, there were 200 companies planning to move from American companies moved from China to India. I think now there's an urgent need to diversify the supply chain. 90% of U.S. pharmaceuticals are manufactured in China. This become a huge security risk. So, anyway, again, I'm here not as a economist or scholar. I'm just to be the old guy on the panel, and I really appreciate all these smart young people, and listen to them. And I hope that one thing I always last point. Oh, never mind. That's good. Thank you.
Are you sure, John?
Yeah, because I will talk all morning.
Okay.
That's enough for me. Thank you.
John, he's being very modest, everyone. so much humility. So Vannery, do you have any comments on opportunities that from this COVID-19 pandemic specific to India and China within the region?
So yes, I do. I have a few. I don't know how to follow up after John. That was, I really appreciate your insight, and as well as Jonathan and Arpit. But there's two countries in particular that I'm going to focus on, and that's Brunei and Cambodia, as far as the ASEAN region. So as a background, my mother's actually a refugee from Cambodia. So I do have a lot of personal interests as far as economic development from the Khmer Rouge War. So obviously Brunei is going to be holding the chair for ASEAN in 2021. And with the COVID response, it's actually going to affect their economy since they're very focused on hydrocarbon, and then just the fact of like future partnerships. As far as Cambodia and with the Belt and Road Initiative with China, when I personally went there, like Arpit and Jonathan and John were kind of stating, there has been a lot of control that China has been taking in Cambodia, where it's actually really starting to affect our culture. So our New Year that we celebrate is very close to when India celebrates Holi in April, and celebrate the same form of Buddhism as in East Asia. So there. It's like half of the digital divide within most of the ASEAN countries that are still trying to have some form of economic development. It's basically an international form of gentrification, in my opinion. It's harder for locals to find job opportunities. It's harder for some to find educational opportunities. So, and yeah, from my understanding,
Vannery, I'm not sure.
Very close relations.
Vannery, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but we're getting some feedback issues from the internet's kind of going in and out. I'm just giving you a heads up.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep,
Yeah.
You sound good now.
Okay, sorry about that. So there's been a lot of investment from the private sector, like I was saying. So in 2021, there's actually going to be a lot of emerging markets from the company 7-Eleven, the convenience store. So now Cambodia will have more access to more from the food desert type of perspective. So there'll be more resources for like fresh water and things like that. So hopefully there'll be more private-public partnerships. That's kind of been stated in some of the research I found, and just what I've seen when I go back and visit in that area. So to create more job creation and circulate the dollar. And I know with the Minister Hussein in Cambodia, he's actually has very close ties to China. So that's definitely affecting like the US relations as far as that. Thanks, Alex.
Great, thank you for your response, Vannery. So my next question, and I'm going to do this kind of as an open forum, so for any panelists that would like to answer the following questions, please do. So it can be argued that China and India are fastly, increasing as emerging economic superpowers. What does that mean for the U.S. influence in the ASEAN region?
Go for it. Okay, I guess I believe that as time goes This isn't, I'm not saying this to disregard the US influence. China is seen as the big Asian giant over there. So since China now is with the One Belt, One Road initiative, all their foreign investment, their growing influence in multilateral institutions, just China starting to revamp its military. I think a lot of countries such as the Philippines, Singapore, whatever, are going to have to court China a lot more. And so, excuse me. So that means that the US is going to lose a lot of influence, a lot of sway within that region. China has been, in their style of diplomacy, they're notorious for being very indirect, completely indirect, harping on their soft power, harping on their economic power, throwing money around throughout the region, throughout the world, buying up various parts, various infrastructure and whatnot. But I actually saw this right before I got on, I saw this where now China is changing their style of diplomacy to what's called a wolf warrior diplomacy. And that means that now they're going to have their diplomats be very aggressive. So the article I was reading, it was pretty much about China trying to control the narrative of COVID-19 responses or how countries perceive them. And so they have their diplomats in various countries attacking anything that doesn't fit their narrative. So I think that post COVID-19, post this, with China's new form of wolf-style diplomacy, you could imagine China being a lot more aggressive within the region. So with the United States, to be honest, I'm not completely sure because it also depends on what happens after the 2020 presidential election. Because Donald Trump, he argues that he's very tough on China, even though he goes back and forth every so often. I mean, his stance has been to pressure China. I'm not sure what will happen post-2020 during the US election, but we shall see. So for India's prowess within the region, I think that the US and the West actually, with proper backing of India and proper, just being in India's corner, could use India or could see India as being a counter to China because, a top 10 economy, a top 5 military now. Their population is supposed to surpass China in 2022. They're the world's largest democracy they are the world's largest democracy actually. And personally, I have a lot of faith in India, so let's see what happens.
Arpit, I see you have your hand raised. Yep. Hold on, you're still muted. Arpit. Yep. Still.
Oh, thank you, Alex.
There we go. Yep. Mm-hmm.
All right. I think US has a huge role to play over here because I think US can really tip the balance and define what direction the world takes from now on. Because even now, US is the largest military power in the world, followed by China and then India. India is the third largest military power in the world right now. And economically as well, the kind of opportunities that the US market and the investments from the United States they present to the world, it's hardly paralleled by any country as of today. Now, if you look at it from the perspective of India and China, you'd see that the United States is the second largest partner in Indian military trade. So India is the second largest importer of arms in the world after Saudi Arabia. And United States, earlier in India, there was a time when 72% of our arms import would come only from Russia. And now we see that it has declined by 47% in the year of 2015 to 19. And now what we see is United States emerging as a larger partner in terms of strategic alliances between India. So strengthening such strategic alliances is certainly the way to go. Secondly, if you look at it, then in economic terms, it was only this year that US has emerged as India's largest trading partner. Because until last year, China was the largest trading partner for our country. But now when you see that China and India trade totals up to $87.07 billion, while the trade with the United States totals up to 87.95. So marginally, the trading partnership between India and the United States has increased. And all experts who are looking at this do see that this trend is going to continue despite some of this isolationist tactics that the current US president seems to be following. But I think things that the United States could do more of, again, on the security side, I'd come back to the South China Sea, because you see, from India's perspective, 55% of the Indian trade goes through South China Sea, and a third of global trade goes into South China Sea. And when we see United States just coming with 2 ships every now and then, as a minister in Singapore commented a few days back, that the United States has to be more assertive over there and show its presence that gives sufficient confidence to other countries in the ASEAN region as well as South Asia that our interests in the South China Sea will see a strong partner in the United States. Now, in addition to that, economically, you'd see that last year, Donald Trump dropped India from the general systems of preference. And that really cost India a lot of, export trade. And not only that, it slapped 25% of, import barriers on steel, 10% on aluminium. So with such tariffs, approximately $7 billion of Indian export industry gets impacted. Now, India has been pushing for greater free trade agreements with the United States, and it's understandable that with the compulsions of overcommitment in global affairs that United States has seen, which has come with a lot of cost, it is understandable that a country like United States would want to take their hands off from different parts of the world. But doing it abruptly and doing it, without the discernment that you need to support some of your trade partners could be problematic. And since I've been a history student, I'll give you an example of history, and it's a trend that I've noticed in history that when the Mughal Empire in India was declining, the Mughal Empire saw this emperor called Aurangzeb. And Aurangzeb is supposed to be the person after whom the empire's decline became sealed. After that, the empire started declining very quickly. And why did that happen? Because Aurangzeb's policy was, it was an immediate rash U-turn from what was happening in the previous generations of the Mughals. Now, you'd see in history that whenever there is an overreaction to a particular trend or to curb a particular trend, it's like, you're going down the hill with a car and the car is skidding down at high speed. And if you pull the brakes immediately or you pull in for a U-turn, your car could go, in a swirl. So there's a method to reducing or reversing the trends that you're facing, because everybody agrees that it is costly for the United States to be over-invested in places. But then coming out, it needs to increase its trading partnership with India and also come to a stance where Afghanistan in particular as a country is not managed or not completely dominated by another country like Pakistan, because eventually here's what's going to happen, Alex, that if US withdraws from Afghanistan abruptly, as we are seeing it is, then what's going to happen is US is going to find its partner in Pakistan over there, which means that all of the aid that Pakistan has been getting from the United States is going to double up. And guess where Pakistan is spending all of that money that it gets from the United States? Pakistan gets most of its arms, does most of its import, not only in arms, but then other material as well from China. So it's like, you take from the United States and you give it to China. And, I remember that there's this IR scholar called Professor Joan Gawa, and he says that, what do nations do when they earn money in free trade or when they earn money as part of a good relation? Because free trade and good relations, they make both countries richer. But as a country gets richer, the first thing they do is that they invest in arming themselves. They care for their security first. So the US has to be more strategic about it. That's what I would say, at least in the way that the foreign policy seems to be progressing currently.
Great, thank you for that overview, Arpit, and for your perspectives. John, you look like you were kind of leaning in to say something. It's showing me that you're muted, so I'm giving you a heads up. But if you wanted to, let me see if I can unmute you from my end. It's showing me that.
There, yes.
There we go.
Okay. Yeah, Alexandria, we can't unmute ourselves, so you have to unmute us, I think.
Oh, okay. I'll work on it. Well,
don't blame you for not unmuting me, but I think in addition, Jonathan mentioned wolf warrior diplomacy. I think the real problem globally is the debt trap diplomacy is a way to describe the Chinese investments globally. And Sri Lanka is a classic example of China coming in, building up the port, and then when Sri Lanka wasn't able to make its payments, it just took over the port, and now is a military base just offshore from India. So, and doing the same in Malaysia and throughout Southeast Asia, besides building their own little islands and claiming them, as was mentioned earlier. So it is a huge problem. The complication with the United States is that it's there's investments. We talk about investments, Arpit mentioned, but the real investments the United States makes is done by private companies who invest abroad. Otherwise, it's government giving money to governments, and that's almost always turned into corruption one way or another, or dangerous liaisons like Arpit mentioned about with Pakistan and Afghanistan. So the problem with the American companies investing in other countries is the laws here are so strict that a CEO goes to jail if somebody in his company bribes somebody to get a seat at the table in another country. So it's very hard for Americans to compete with China, with a mercantile system of China that can, everything is fungible there. Money can go from this industry to that one, and then they can kill any industry locally, worldwide that they want to. So it's two completely different systems, and very hard to see them working smoothly, integrating. Ideally, I hope that the world trends toward freedom and free markets so that everybody has the opportunity equally, and government doesn't choose winners and losers and decide what industry does what, but really unleash the power of the people and directly, independently. That's what I would like to see. And I hope, I was just in Guyana in February, and China is huge there, buying up, all the port, and also in Cambodia, I think, Benari, the China's buying up the coastline there, and it's very dangerous, I think. And it's kind of a huge global trend. And India, thank goodness for India, because I think that is and this is the best opportunity ever for India as China becomes a real bad boy and becomes visibly so. India is a most important partner. Russia is almost irrelevant now. Their economy is the size of France, and they really are vulnerable because of the oil dependence on oil and their own economy makes them very weak. So Russia really doesn't matter anymore. In the old days, that was why India was really critical. But now China's become this really remarkable force, and I think more than ever, India is absolutely critical globally. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for your for the points that you made. Vannery, China and India in respect to the U.S. influence within the ASEAN community.
Okay.
If you have,
yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a couple of points that I want to highlight. So I want to piggyback off of what Jonathan Cummins stated as far as with security issues, as far as the United States. There is a couple of military bases that are very close to the ASEAN region. So the Diego Garcia Islands, which is under the British, which is one of the British territories, we actually have a contract with the British Parliament as a military base there to kind of serve as a security issue. So there needs to be more utilization from the security preference from the Diego Garcia Islands, as well as the other U.S. territories in the Pacific region from American Samoa and Guam. As far as increasing international trade between and create the U.S. influence in the ASEAN region, the United States companies are actually losing money due to lack of intellectual property protection regulations, as far as with India and with Indonesia, and as long as with the other ASEAN countries, Vietnam, Cambodia. So like John Dixon stated, it's very interesting when you incorporate the private sector and who is governing those entities as far as who's protecting these companies that are stationed in the U.S. from losing money, and then who's protecting the companies when they're overseas and they're getting bribed to having a seat at the table. So there needs to be more advocacy about that. And so as far as with the ASEAN, there's been an emphasis on trying to figure out how do we provide developing nations with the technology to provide cyber protection to these companies so they can keep their companies regulated, so countries like China doesn't replicate, making money off of the U.S.-based intellectual property protections. Jumping over into the private sector, in order for the United States to keep their influence, there definitely still needs to be a continuation of investments from the private sector. So just a couple of legislations and initiatives that the U.S. government has is the BUILD Act, which facilitates the participation of private sector capital and skills and job skill sets for the economy for low developing and middle economies. The Asia Edge, which is another effort to grow sustainable and secure energy markets throughout the Indo-Pacific. The Blue Dot Network is participants from both the private, public, and civil society sectors, which is building financial infrastructure, and also more the coalition between the United States, Japan, and Australia to kind of help create engagement to utilize Australia more as their influence because they are so close.
Thank you, Vannery. So I'm also realizing, and I've been trying to figure out how to incorporate it, but I haven't, getting the chat function working for Zoom. So if you do have a question for any participants, what you're going to have to do is raise your hand, and I will unmute you so that you can ask your question. So we have one participant who I'm going to unmute and allow you to ask that question. So we'll take a few questions from the audience, and then we'll end with some concluding thoughts, if that's okay with all the panelists. So we have this gentleman here who I will unmute, Mr. Abdurrahib Daz. I believe that you are unmuted now to be able to ask your question. Hi, so I'm not sure if you can hear me clearly, but the sound is going in it. The sound is really distorted, so we're having a hard time hearing what you're saying. No, not clear. I can like slightly hear it, but it's still pretty disrupted that we can't hear the question clearly. Okay, so I think he's logged off and logged back on, but I'm going to go ahead to the next question that I had here, and we'll try it again in the future if there's someone with a question to try to raise your hand, and we'll let you ask it. So my next question is, imagine a world where India is fully recognized as a superpower. What would that look like in regards to geopolitical relations? And again, I'll leave that open to anyone who wants to answer. I see Arpit kind of leaning in, ready to respond here. So let me unmute you.
Thank you, Alex.
Yep.
So I think that's a great question, Alex, because India, in its hearts of hearts, has been trying to regain the position in the world that over centuries that it seems to have lost, and there's a great sense and determination in the Indian people that we want to reassert our position in the global order. Now, how would the world look like if India is able to reassert itself? I mean, this is one thing that I keep telling my friends. My roommate at Cornell was from Costa Rica, and Jonathan, and you would know him, Ron. And Ron and I, we used to have a lot of conversation about how Costa Rica exists as a state. It exists as a state with a number of values. It believes in the free market. It believes in peace and harmony. And it believes in that whole, cultural value, what they call pura vida, or pure life. And sometimes I feel that, if India was, India in its completely realized self would believe in something like pura vida. And in fact, if you look at ancient Indian texts, they talk about this fundamental security ideology, which is called Vasudev Kutumbakam, which means the world is our family. And this is an oft and sometimes overused phrase in India. And that's something that you grow up with listening to in your schools, in your family, everywhere, that, just like United States was founded by free marketeers, India was founded, or the whole civilizational thought of India was founded by people who believed in the concept of the whole world being our family. So a completely, India, if it were to completely realize itself, would be, a country which believes in the dignity of all other countries, because we as a nation, we've seen how, bad it could be once a country is subjugated by another. And it would believe in the whole ideal of a leadership where other countries, even if they are not fundamentally bought into the idea of the world that we have, also have a chance to grow. And, a country like India already shows that when we reach out to a country like Pakistan, or when we reach out to a country like China, even in these critical times, when people in India are in equal, and if not more, in need of medical assistance, we are still, offering open help, and indeed going and helping out other countries, even if they have been India's critique traditionally. So, if India is the leader of the world, I think it would be the equivalent of a free market thinking in security perspectives. And to add to just add to what John Dixon said, that India is that sort of a girl who wines and dines with everybody. I think India has got this history of non-alignment, and it's got it's really, if it were to be compared, then it would be compared to this independent woman who has realized its potential, and wants to figure out the best for herself.
Thank you, Arpit. Jonathan Cummings, did you have any points you wanted to make on India as an emerging superpower in the geopolitical perspective?
Well, I think India is a fully realized superpower. I believe that India will have a lot of good geopolitical relations with a lot of other countries throughout the world. I know India is one of the only countries that I know that has a good relationship with the US and Russia at the same time. So I find that fascinating, actually. I believe that India will ramp up its commitments to multilateralism and aid and diplomacy. And I know they've actually been very, very proactive with that. Now, Arpit mentioned India giving aid to different countries in the time of a COVID-19 pandemic right now. I know they've committed $1 billion in aid to combat COVID-19, and this aid has been going to different countries like Pakistan, countries that typically aren't India's allies. And in the United Nations space, India has served as a member of the Security Council 14 times, actually. And people have even talked about trying to make them a permanent member, which I think be very interesting, actually. I see India as a fully realized superpower. They'll actually expand their commitments to multilateral organizations, do a lot more aid and investment projects globally. Right now, they're the second largest Asian investor in Africa. Now, beyond China, they invest a lot within Africa. And India's economy is it's supposed to be the second largest economy by 2030, right? Surpassing United States, actually. By 2050, the ranking should be China, India, the United States, and Indonesia, I believe. But that's just projected right now. So India is a fully realized power. I see good geopolitical relations with a lot of other countries, an increase in investments and an increase in aid to multilateral organizations and development projects globally. So.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. So I'm going to attempt to unmute one person who has raised their hand, Jasmine. Let me see now. It says you're unmuted. So if you could try asking your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Firstly, thank you very much to the panelists for a fantastic brief on India and China as emerging powers. I think it's been very enlightening. Just as a little bit of background, I'm actually a student at the London School of Economics in international relations. So of course, everything that you mentioned today is very, very relatable. My question is, what are the challenges that India would likely face with China? I mean, in the last few days, we've seen some tensions at the Sino-India border, but could there be a possibility for a wider military escalation? And of course, with a certain level of intrusion with Pakistan, all of this in the light of trade and economic developments that would take place in India in terms of supply chain shifting, in terms of stronger defense agreements between India and US, and also India's role in the Quad.
Great, thank you for your question, Jasmine. Would anyone like to start with a response on that?
Yeah, I can go if that's okay.
Okay.
So first of all, thank you, Jasmine, for that question. And I know that a number of people have been analyzing the scenario that what if things escalate between India and China? There have already been, on the economic side, there have already been certain tariffs that India has imposed over China. And, it's in fact, China was trying to increase its acquisition in one of one of the leading Indian banks, and India kind of changed its laws in order to block that sort of a greater share of China in an Indian bank. So, and also, as you rightly said, that there have been certain sort of tensions on the borders, but at the same time, I think that an all-out military confrontation or escalation is perhaps a very low probability scenario, and the reason is as follows. the reason is that both of them are nuclear powers, and they're not nuclear powers, and the power differential between the both of the nations is not as huge as the power differentials, for example, that exist between India and Pakistan. Now, India and Pakistan both are again nuclear powers, and a lot of military strategists had predicted that there would be no war in between these countries when both of these countries became nuclear capable. But still, we've seen that we've fought at least at least one major war and one skirmish after having fully developed nuclear capacities. But at the same time, it is worth understanding two things: that India and Pakistan, they have their own household issues that have been going on from at least two generations. At the same time, on the cultural front, India and China in the in the past millennia have just fought one war in 1963, and culturally there's much much less misgiving. In fact, there's a lot of bonhomie culturally between the two countries. At the same time, the power differential between the two countries, India and China, is not so great, and that's why we also realize that why did there was no all-out war or a direct confrontation between the United States and Russia, because it turned into a Cold War for sure, and that still could be that cold sort of a competition could be a plausible scenario. But then any serious escalations are unlikely, and at the same time, I think there certainly will be increased competition in the economic space and in the influence space in global politics for sure. I hope that answers your question, Jav.
Great, thank you, Arpit, for that. And what I'll also ask us to do as panelists is if we have a response to a question or want to jump in, I think we have the option to do the raise hand, click the raise hand button. So if you can select that so that I don't miss your response to anything. So if anyone else didn't have a response to that, I'll take one more question from the, John, did you have?
One thing just a point I'd like to make, very simple one, and international relations, really important. My wife is British, so I spend a lot of time in London. My sister-in-law is Pakistani there, so, and there's a lot of smart people on this call, and they're very wise about international relations. And when you get into the professional world of that, you meet with other very smart people in international relations in five-star hotels and eat very nice meals and talk to each other, and often don't actually meet or understand or know the people who you're making decisions about and for. That's in all these fantastic spaces of international relations or international health policy and any of these things. But it boils down to, I think very simply, the world is broken because relationships are broken. So international relations is human relations. And even what's going on in this call is so very critical, because this is how we solve the problems. It's really person to person and knowing who you're making decisions about and for. So I always encourage folks like yourselves, brilliant young people, to, I work with indigenous Americans and Native American communities who, by the way, are happy that Columbus wasn't looking for Turkey. You figure that out later, but so that, sorry. The chiefs and almost all these tribes, there's more than 500 tribes in the United States. They all have different cultures, different language. But they all say that the journey from here to here is the longest journey. That down here is where we're, if you can see, this is where we're all connected to each other. Up here is where we're really different. And unfortunately, most of education is just about up here, and we ignore down here. So this is where the solution is, down here. This is where our connection is. And Arpit, I'm really happy to hear you explain Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, right? Yeah.
You got that right.
Well, okay, but I didn't know that it really was that ubiquitous in India. I thought it was something that in the old days people might have mentioned, but this idea that the world, we are one family, I think is a core principle that can fix all these problems. There's not any difference between people on any level in any way. They're all the same heart, same spirit, and we want the same for ourselves and our families. So I'm real happy to hear you say it, and very happy to know that actually people grow up with that. And it is easy to take for granted things like that. But that's the key, and that if India holds true to that guiding principle, then India, I hope, become a powerful superpower, and because that's a vision that just liberates people and empowers people, doesn't diminish them. So I really hope that I'd love to see that happen. Sorry for that long explanation.
No, don't apologize. Thank you.
You guys are awesome here, by the way.
Thank you for that. So we're going to take one more question from the audience, and then I'm going to let each panelist give their concluding thoughts. So we're going to go to, it says Dr. Daniel, team 54. So I believe I've unmuted you. If you're able to answer, it says that you're unmuted, so.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I want to frame the question like this. As an African, we do know fully well that following a model that can achieve sustainable development goal must be framed to the peculiarity of our region. I believe that India has been able to harness that ability. So the question should be this: what does our panelists, what do you people have as an advice? What did India do right? Because the COVID has happened, but we know before now, India and China has already achieved the level. Now that every other advanced nation is struggling, what did China get right in the last 4 or 5 years before COVID took place? That is what every African nation needs to modify. Are there things in your observation level, what you've seen in tech, education, capacity to lift people up? Are there something that you've seen in the last 2-3 years so that when we have a COVID time like this, the economy is still buoyant to generate stimulus package, to revamp, and even reduce the number of cases that they have?
Great. Thank you so much for that question. And what I'm going to ask the panelists to do is, if you're open to addressing that question, then please do. But because we're coming up on 10:30, if you could go ahead and include your concluding thoughts in your response, and I'll start off with Jonathan Cummings.
Oh, so I'm just thinking about how China runs its government and its economy. China is very, as we all know, and has an authoritarian regime. But the one thing, so I've done this where I've actually just watched a whole bunch of movies and things on Netflix about Chinese history and everything. And one thing, my father and I talk about this, with China, when they make a plan, they stick to it. It doesn't matter if it's like 1,000 years or 100 years, they stick to the plan. So they're incredibly disciplined. I mean, regardless of what we have to say, I mean, they are incredibly disciplined when it comes to making a plan. So in regards to the continent of Africa and the various countries in Africa, Africa is has some of the youngest populations throughout the world. You know, like Nigeria is has the largest economy in Africa, and it's a power center. And what I think that a continent needs to do, or the various countries need to do, is that they need to tap into their young people, their young population. They need to bring up an array of diversity of different ideas, diversify their economy, do more advancements in technology and whatnot, and they need proper government support, and they need proper government support to be behind it. So I know my time is short, so I'll go to the next person.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. We'll go to Vannery Kong next.
Okay, so as far as the ASEAN and the African Union, I know one of my friends that works for the African Congress. She's actually shared with me about how they're actually working on documentation to creating a stronger union between the two blocks to create more incentives for getting members from those countries and within those blocks into STEM fields to provide that type of technology and to get people that live in those countries to get jobs to compete in the global markets. As far as India being a superpower, I know that with COVID-19, it has affected the signing of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And the fact, so Australia and Japan are actually trying to renegotiate with India to join the RCEP to sign it to basically create that power balance within China. And then to go back to your question as far as what China has done, right? The infrastructure building on one hand is beautiful, but people can't afford to live in the apartments because they can't get jobs and they can't go to school. So there's only so much that you can do with that. But as far as India's investments in development, as far as keeping the historical context of like the Angkor Wat Temple, I think that's also something that's been done, right? And just to create that that partnership in between the public and private sectors. So that's pretty much what I've seen.
Great, thank you so much, Bannery. John Dixon.
Daniel, good to see you. I don't think I've ever gone into the United Nations headquarters without bumping into this guy. He's a tremendous, famous troublemaker in the United Nations. But Daniel, you said ask the Nigerians in Guangzhou about China's response to COVID. I think it's one thing the world hardly knows about it because there's no transparency in China. And I think the initial response shutting down Wuhan and all the flights to the provinces of China and allowing the international flights for 3 weeks was, you can't applaud an action like that. So I'm kind of very disappointed about China's response. And I think we still don't know really any real numbers because, as Jonathan mentioned, it's an authoritarian regime that protects information and it's not open in that way. That's my immediate response to that. And I love to see. I mean, Nigeria is another, as Jonathan mentioned, a huge youth population there, and young people like yourself are really lighting up worldwide. And I think also not just. I think in the past, the regimes, the response to colonialism wasn't really so much freedom, but kind of a different kind of colonialism in most of Africa. And the young people for opportunity had to go away. Now people are coming back. And I think that this is a fantastic, exciting time for Africa and the nations of Africa. The world is flat. It is one family, as Arpit mentioned, and what a wonderful contribution historically Africa's given, and from now it's so very important. This last year, the 2019 year of return was a fascinating for Americans, a fascinating opportunity, and that's enough. China really has to be. I think people finally can see what the regime means, how it the impacts that kind of system has on its people and globally, and that needs to change, in my opinion. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your perspective. And last but not least, Professor Chaturvedi.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Daniel, for your question. I think I just take the part when you asked that what did China do right, and in general, what can African countries learn from China and even India? I think to begin with, I think a lot of African countries have a lot to teach India, China, other countries, the kind of entrepreneurship stories, and entrepreneurship stories not only when big capital is involved, but then when small scale capital is there and coming out with breakthroughs in entrepreneurship is something that the whole world can learn from a number of African countries, including Nigeria, because in the future, that I think is going to be the driver of the global economy and in general sustainable development as well. Now, I think in terms of what China and India got right in different arenas, though, is mixed strategies. So, even in game theory, when you see a number of times when, scientists observe animal behavior and evolutionary stable strategies generally tend to be mixed strategies. So for example, democracy is a mixed strategy. It's adaptive because it's not an authoritarian rule, neither it is anarchy, right? At the same time, the kind of market strategy that China has been able to adopt, where there is government support, but then there's also, in reality, a lot of free entrepreneurship as well. So I think that there's a sort of adaptive equilibrium that mixed strategies bring in, and India has been able to do that politically, China more economically. And I think that is probably the, one of the secret sauces to development.
Arpit, thank you so much for that perspective. And thank you to all of our panelists who spoke today and gave perspectives. I know we're a few minutes over, but again, this was a really fruitful conversation as we continue to move forward and hopefully, in a continued collective approach to the world's challenges and pandemics that we currently face. So I'll go ahead and conclude the talk there. And again, thank you to the panelists and thank you to everyone who joined in the conversation today.
Thank you, Alexandria. Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandria.
Alex.
Sure, thanks. Have a great day, everyone.